Jesus is God. Jesus is Lord. Jesus has the victory.
We all have a call to greatness, a desire for it. We want to do something good.
Now is your time. You could change the world, and the world needs changing, so get busy.
Shalom World, God's own channel.
Welcome to Luminous. My name is Joshua Clemmons. I'm just going to kind of share with you a little bit of my life story, actually, especially in light of Lent and trying to come into contact with God's love and perhaps really believe in it and find new hope in a message that maybe you've heard before or perhaps you haven't, and this will be altogether new, and it'll be a new proclamation of the gospel to you. But it will be from the lens of my own experience. Back in school, back in college, I studied philosophy, and I was also kind of studying a little bit of literature. There was a lot of questions about the themes that would come up, and I was always looking at arguments and things, and I really like a good syllogism where you have a couple premises that lead to a logical conclusion. This, therefore, that. So anything that was structured like that was always appealing to me. But one of them that was appealing to my heart in a different way, that seemed to kind of bridge the gap between all the themes that you'd find in literature of things like desire and all the different ways that people try to fulfill their desire and all these books and stories, was the argument for the existence of God from desire. Now, there are great arguments for the existence of God, better ones even more perhaps scientific and sure. But this one spoke not just to my head, but it spoke something to my heart. It gave me a vision of myself, my own desire. It was a kind of mirror. I never knew that an argument could do such a thing, but some of its premises, some of the things that you have to assume in order for the argument to work, really spoke to me. One thing is, when we look to our hearts, when we look to our desire, we look to our will, we find that nothing seems to fully satisfy us. St. Augustine is famously quoted for having said that we're made for God. Our hearts are restless until they rest in Him. And that is absolutely true, but why in God specifically? It doesn't quite make sense if we think of God as some finite good amongst many other goods. But when we think of God as the infinite good, the infinitely beautiful, the infinitely true, then it starts to correspond to something on our own selves. So as I look back at my upbringing, and I see all of these different dead ends I might pursue. I might get really into technology, or I might get really into trying to pursue money or a relationship. None of them seemed to fully satisfy. They always left something wanting. They all seemed a little bit less like a full meal and more like an appetizer of sorts, something that was pointing me to the next thing. So as this argument for the existence of God starts from desire, it looks at that desire and it says, this desire is without measure. It keeps going. It wants a corresponding infinite good. So then I look at all my other desires and I say, I have other desires. Say, I want to fly because I saw Superman do it once. But I learned that desire. I wasn't born wanting that. I had to see somebody. But there are other things that I am born with in my nature that I desire innately. One of those things might be water. And I look at this desire for water, this thirst, and I realize there is a real objective thing that exists out in the world that corresponds to this desire. Nature didn't lie to me by putting that desire in me. Other desires, things like food. There is food. It exists. The desire for sex, that exists. The desire for sleep, that exists. All of these other things seem to exist. But what about my desire for other kinds of things? Spiritual goods, things like goodness, truth, beauty, love. I've never once heard somebody say, I've had enough love, top me off. I'm good. I will be fine for a while. No. We want more, always more. Love satisfies, but infinite love satisfies infinitely, and that seems to be what we would need to fill this void. Some people might say this in a different way. You have a God-shaped hole in your heart. So if I look at my desire and I say, okay, I have innate desires, and all of my innate desires seemingly have a corresponding thing that exists that actually satisfies them. I have an innate desire that is infinite for goodness, truth, beauty, love. Therefore, there must be this thing that is infinitely good, true, beautiful, and loving. Is it just one thing? Other arguments are used to pull all these things into one simple existent, namely God. But looking at my desire and seeing that, other things start becoming more clear. If we don't reflect on our own heart's desire, then what happens? We unconsciously and unknowingly try to fill that void. G.K. Chesterton, I believe, is who it said, every man who goes into a brothel is really looking for God. In some way, that's true. It's unconscious. He's looking for something, and he's looking in all the wrong places. So, the message of the gospel gives us a very conscious, very clear statement. Your desires are not lies. They correspond to your desire for heaven. You're made for more than just these finite things. I find this very consoling. Otherwise, what good is this desire? Other religions might have another answer. They might try to say, you know what, the problem and the reason why you suffer is because this desire exists. So if you can rout out the desire, then you'll reach nirvana. You'll reach some sort of peace. But this is kind of a hopeless peace in my mind. It's saying, you know, these other things don't exist, so I shouldn't hope for them anymore. No, Christianity says outright, very clearly, the good news, the gospel says, no, hope for these things. Hope for them, because they exist. And the only way you actually achieve it is, the only way you grasp this good is through hoping for it, having faith that it exists, and ultimately connecting with it and loving. This it isn't simply an it, it's God. It's not simply an object of pursuit, but a subject of pursuit. Actually, this good is pursuing you and infinitely loves you. Man, how do we begin to comprehend that? God knows we can't simply just comprehend it, so he communicates us in different ways. Early on, he communicated through prophets. He communicated through his word and the sacraments. And these kind of sacraments that didn't necessarily carry all the grace that our current sacraments do. And finally, in a real way, he becomes a human being to communicate to us fully through a whole lived out human life. And ultimately a death and resurrection to communicate to us the depths of this love. How can we hear this message anew every day and reorient ourselves to that ultimate end? How do we keep that in mind? Because as we continue forward, so often it feels so far in the future when this desire will be fully satisfied. It's so much easier to turn to other things. It's so much easier to become distracted. I know for me, if I'm waiting in line at a grocery store or what have you, my first impression or my first knee-jerk reaction isn't always to pray and to place myself before God and to orient my heart and my mind and my soul back to my end, my ultimate end. No, I end up pulling out a phone and playing on social media or anything else so that I don't have to be alone with God. Why is that? Why do I, at one point in my heart, run to God, but in another part of my heart, run away from him? There's a problem. There's some sort of issue in me that I have inherited from the first human beings, Adam and Eve. We know that they sinned against God. They in some ways ran away from him. It seems to us that God is hidden so often, but it's actually our first parents, Adam and Eve, that hid themselves because of the shame of sin. This shame, perhaps, is that part in me that says, I'm unholy, I'm sinful, I'm dirty, I can't be before this ultimate good God. Perhaps it's a pride that I want to be on the same par, the same level, to be able to be in conversation with him. However, if I come to prayer, I first have to have an act of humility. Every act of prayer is an act of humility and of hope. A humility that God is God and I am not. And hope that his mercy will overcome any dirtiness, impurity, or sin that I might have, that we can enter into some sort of communion. Whenever people in the Bible come into contact with God, it's so often the case that they are afraid. They fall on their faces, or they say, get away from me. Like, I'm a sinful person from sinful people. We know that they desire God, just like every person in some part of their soul desires God. They have that same hole in their heart that's God-shaped. But yet, in some weird contradiction in our hearts, we push away. So overcoming that push, having the courage to overcome those fears and to ultimately trust in God and not ourselves, is the first place we start. And entering into that prayer, so often the case, is that God meets us there in an embrace of mercy. I know for me, I have one good really story about this that I experienced in a special way. I went to a place called Christ in the Desert. It's a monastery in New Mexico. And up to that point, I thought I'd been pursuing God pretty well because, like I say, I like arguments. I like philosophy. I like theology. So I had been reading all of these books, and anytime I had kind of a moment, I was either texting, messaging on social media, or I had a book in front of my face, something theological. I would read about prayer, but it seemed so difficult to actually just pray. So I went to a monastery to retreat, to get away from all the distractions and to pray. I thought it would be easier. I thought whenever I got there, I would just start praying and it would just happen. But when I got to my little room, my little cell, I went for my theology books right away. But there weren't a whole lot of lights, and the sun went down. I was wide awake. I couldn't go to sleep suddenly, so here I am, wide awake. I go for my phone, but there is no reception because we're in the desert. Nothing. So I have no phone. I have no books. I have no way of distracting myself, and suddenly I realize in a kind of cold shiver that now I am going to enter into this holy space of prayer. I'm going to receive the gift of prayer, this grace that God always wanted to give me. And I was frightened. So I dropped to my knees, and I closed my eyes, and a peace overwhelmed me. I don't get this every time I pray, but I think that special day, he wanted to give me something to remember. He wanted to say, be not afraid, it is I. This God who loves me so much wants a relationship. He was in pursuit the entire time. He cornered me in a monastery, if you will, and loved me. And I knew I was loved, so here I am now, speaking with you, a voice of one who is loved. I look to my desires and I see a prophecy for God. I invite you, too, to look to all those places where you might try to distract yourself, where you don't pull away from the world, where you don't look at that really deep down bedrock desire for something more. My message is one of hope. It says, not only does this good exist, but this good takes the form of intimacy with your soul and pursues you and consoles you and gives a peace that surpasses all understanding. How do we really believe in this love? It's so difficult sometimes because it sounds great, but man, I look around and I see all kinds of evil. I see terrible things. There's another argument that sometimes atheists will use, people who don't want to believe in God at all. And it's probably the strongest argument for atheism, so I'll say it now, what it will be, and perhaps refute it for you. It's the problem of evil. how does an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God allow evil to exist in the world? Pain, suffering. It's a difficult one that pretty much every saint has wrestled with. The Bible doesn't hold back from wrestling with this. We look to the book of Job, we see Ecclesiastes, and ultimately we see Jesus. And we see this argument. In my life, my deepest moments of doubt, this was an argument that was right in there in front of my face. And with it in mind, I went back to the story of Jesus. And I began to kind of think, okay, if I think of Jesus as ultimate goodness, he is the good. And he becomes a human being, he takes on flesh. So infinite good, this is the good. Every other good that we can imagine is a participation in that goodness. And goodness itself, we kill. We put him on a cross, we drive nails into his hands and his feet, we crown him with thorns, making fun in some ways of goodness. Is there a worse imaginable moral evil, a worse pain than losing the most beautiful life? Unimaginable. Not even theoretically, but this is an historical reality. God, the good, becomes a human being and dies on a cross. We kill him. And at that moment, God, whose grace is so powerful, we see the sin, it's abounding. His grace abounds more and just devours death and sin and evil. And he uses this bigness of sin, this worst imaginable evil, this worst sin, and he uses it to complete this great plan of salvation, a great imaginable good. And he gives to us himself, the good itself, by means of his cross and resurrection. So we know that this problem of evil, this problem of pain, at that moment wasn't a problem at all. It was the means by which God chose to communicate himself. The best argument for atheism is what God used to actually convince me in my moments of doubt that not only does he exist, but he can take care of any problem. He is not afraid of my sinfulness. He's not afraid of your sinfulness. There isn't any dirty that is so dirty that he can't clean us. So I came out of my doubt at that. I know that there's a great mystery when it comes to all the pain and suffering that we see or that we experience or that we inflict. But that ultimately, trusting in God beyond all things, we can come into a much deeper relationship with him and a much deeper hope than anything in this world can possibly promise. And at that moment, when we realize that, I think that nothing else satisfies. That no matter the politics, the policies, the businesses, all the things that we try to do to make the world better or perfect, when they all fail, we can still have hope. When all else fails, we can still come to God in prayer, and he'll embrace us and say, "Be not afraid." And so, how do we grow in this? How do we grow in this? How do we dive deeper into the mystery? There are icons of this mystery all around. We see it everywhere in the daily things. We have moments filled with infinity, filled with eternity. In my own life, recently, it's been my wife. She's really brought it home to me, whether she knows it or not. She has given me the great gift of herself in marriage. But recently we have got the news that I'm going to be a father and she's going to be a mother. I have my son there in the womb, and my wife's body is changing every day, and I hear her before the mirror, kind of with a half smile, a little bit of a sense of humor, saying, "I'm getting so big," or "I have stretch marks, I'm seeing them." And these changes in her body that perhaps she won't necessarily return to that same body she had before pregnancy. I have a moment where I see some icon, some image of the kind of love that maybe God has for me too. Every time I go to Mass, I hear, "Here is my body given up for you." And every time I hear my wife saying, "Here are my stretch marks, here's these changes that are happening," I hear very similarly, "Here is my body given for you." And my son, if he could understand, "This is my body given for you," the love of that mother is a great first impression that this universe is not one that's just empty. It's not just a vacuum. It's not hopeless. But no, not only is it not hopeless, not only is this desire in your heart that's God-shaped, something that's just supposed to be there, a trick of nature. No, it's a prophecy. It's a promise. It's something that points us to see everything that happens in our world, good and evil, in a new light, and to see it all with hope and gratitude. And with that hope, with that humility before such a great mystery, we can enter into the mystery of prayer. So without further ado, right now, take a few moments, take 2, and just be with God for a moment. Look to that desire. Make that leap of hope to say, it isn't worthless. It's a message handcrafted for you since before you were born. And offer yourself once again to God. Offer your life to pursuing that mystery. So, we've talked about the infinite desire for God that's in our heart, how that points to God and gives us a little bit of an argument for his existence. We see the hope that exists in knowing that God loves us and pursues us, and that he corresponds to that God-shaped hole in our heart. We've seen how we might grow in realizing that love and mystery, facing all the things that might contradict it in the world, and ultimately seeing in all the little moments of life some icon of God's love for you individually, or just ultimately for humanity and in the universe, that there isn't anything that isn't somehow showing God's mercy and love. I hope that this helps you to continue in your pursuit of the true, the good, the beautiful, and that perhaps we can get away from some of the distractions and center ourselves on that ultimate end for which our heart desires.
Shalom tidings. This is good news for a new generation. Discover God's constant presence amidst the hopelessness in our lives. Tiffany Layton writes about losing her young husband to horrific violence in Clinging to the Cross. God's grace showed Anne Noel how to be a merciful woman. Brother Manis Matus tells us why misery, pain, and suffering can indeed be a gift. Lisa Duffy shares her experiences in escaping the dangers of the divorce culture. Patty Knapp understands the infinite value of having a Mass said, and so much more. Read about how God gives hope for the heartbroken in the February-March 2015 issue of Shalom Tidings. Visit shalomworld.org/tidings. Also available in Barnes & Noble stores,